I just saw a fireball and then it was just gone.
Airline anxiety is surging after back-to-back crashes leave more than 90 people dead.
When Americans take off in airplanes, they should expect to land.
This week on Open Record, America's aviation safety system is under the microscope.
Our mission is to understand not just what happened, but why it happened.
And new information is emerging in Milwaukee and Chicago
The reports are staggering.
about close calls no one told you about until now. From the FOX6 studios, this is Open Record. I'm Bryan Polcyn. Sarah Smith is sitting out this week, and I am joined by FOX6 investigative reporter and news content manager Amanda St. Hilaire. Welcome back, Amanda.
Hi, happy to be here.
Good to have you on the podcast again. And we are joined by FOX6 reporter Sam Kraemer. Sam, good to have you back as well.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
We are recording this episode on Wednesday, February 5th, 2025. It's now been 1 week as we record since a military helicopter collided with a commercial jetliner over the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. Mid-air collisions like this are exceptionally rare. But aviation safety records show trouble has been brewing now for some time, and close calls may happen more often than you think. We'll get into all of that after this. And we are back on Open Record. It has been 1 week since the U.S. airline industry's 14-year safety streak was tragically broken as a military Black Hawk helicopter collided in midair with an American Airlines jet over the Potomac River in Washington, D.C., killing all 67 people aboard both aircraft. It was just 2 days later that a Learjet air ambulance crashed outside a shopping mall in northeast Philadelphia. That killed 24 people in the aircraft and on the ground. Needless to say, guys, there's some high anxiety right now about air travel in the United States, especially with these two incidents back to back.
I have a trip planned in March, and I'm already thinking, okay, how are we going to feel at that time when we're going to get in, go through security, and it's already kind of this anxious process, but once you finally get on that plane and you're cleared for takeoff, I'm already curious about what I'm going to be thinking.
And we've heard from a lot of viewers who feel exactly the same way. I know I have friends who have bought last minute tickets to fly with their parents who don't feel comfortable going in and out of everything. So it's one of those things where as journalists, we want to balance the context of, hey, these things are rare, but also the urgency and the very real fear of some truly horrific things have just happened.
Well, and I think there's something about air travel and the idea of an airplane crash. We can statistically, I can tell you right now very clearly, you're far more likely to die in a car crash, getting in your car that you're going to do every day, than you are in an airplane. And yet there's something about air travel that just generates that sense of anxiety. And so many of us, I don't know, what is that all about, do you think?
I don't know.
Control.
That and just kind of a blind trust, right? You get up in the sky and you can't really see. There are clouds, and just kind of, there is just a level of blind trust that you imagine that you're going to expect and you should expect to land.
And I think it's when you're behind the wheel, and some of this may be wishful thinking, but there's the idea of, I have some say in what happens here, right? If there's someone on the road who's out of control, I have a chance to avoid that. When you're on a plane, that sense of control goes away right away. And I think there are also a lot of assumptions. Hey, these people know what they're doing. This stuff happens all the time. Everything's going to be okay.
I think about, and maybe in a case where there's a sudden collision, if hopefully in that case people don't know what's happening and they don't have time to think. I think the terrifying part is the thought of going down in an airplane where you have time to process what is happening to you, to think about the loved ones you're leaving behind, or what's. I think that is the part that terrifies most people. That said, even though it's rare, like you said, doesn't mean that there aren't some very serious things to be concerned about, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I want to start with these couple of incidents recently, though, particularly the D.C. crash that involved the American Eagle, actually, an American Airlines regional jet that was crashed into by a military helicopter. What all do we know about that at this point? I mean, the NTSB is obviously investigating, but we're already getting drips and drops of what happened there.
Well, it sounds like there are multiple factors that were potentially involved in this, and we won't know the full extent until we get that final report. But knowing all the different things that were kind of happening at the same time, there's a reason that now there's really a heightened focus. You know, when we talk about the shortage of air traffic controllers, we talk about communications when people are in the air. We know that the military chopper was flying outside its flight path. So I think that convergence of all those different factors is what makes this such an interesting case.
And in Philadelphia, obviously, the visuals that we've seen of the plane crashing, and there's the doorbell camera of the one couple that's just leaving, and then there's this intense explosion, and it happens in a high-traffic area right outside a shopping mall in an urban area. That stuff is not stuff we usually see.
No.
But there's no connection between these two, right?
Right. I think it's just incredibly unfortunate timing, combined with the fact that you are seeing so much of this. I mean, there are officials in Philadelphia saying, hey, go through your yards, go look and see if you have any pieces of this airplane that the NTSB could use to help kind of piece this together. That shows you, I guess, kind of how serious this is. But again, it is really just an unfortunate kind of staggering of two incidents in high visual areas that I think lead a lot of people to question, how safe am I?
Whenever something like this happens, one of the first things we do in local news is we say, okay, what's the impact on us here? Anyone who flies certainly can relate to the fear of now getting up in an airplane, and you know, most of these things happen usually upon takeoff or upon descent. And here it was, they were on descent from Wichita into Washington, D.C. But we want to know, what about maybe our local airports, and where do you begin to look at this? I mean, one thing we want to know is, anybody on the plane from Milwaukee? Thankfully, no. Or Wisconsin? No. But in that case, what else can we learn about this that might impact our listeners, our viewers here in Milwaukee? And maybe you two can tell me a little bit about what you did to start that process.
So from the news manager perspective, and then Sam can jump in from the reporter perspective, a lot of time when there's a big national story, the natural reaction is, okay, what is the impact here? Like you said, I'll be candid and say that sometimes attempts to localize those big national stories can be unsatisfying pieces of journalism, right? Hey, let's go talk to people and see how they feel about this big bad thing that just happened. Okay, I can probably write that story right now. And we've done those kinds of things in the past. Then there's the next category of meaningful follow-ups that start to scratch the surface. And we certainly did some of those where, okay, we know we have those local connections. We know the skating community was really affected by the crash over the Potomac because of people on board and their ties to the skating community. So we have local elements of that here. We know that locally we have the search and rescue operations, and Ashley Sears did a very meaningful piece about that. And then there's the next level, and this is the harder level of journalism, and it's one that doesn't always get pursued, and I'm grateful we have reporters like Sam who are able to pursue them. But that is the digging of, could this happen here? Has this happened here? Has this almost happened here? What is the direct impact of our viewers in our area? And then that's where Sam's piece of journalism comes in.
And I know that there's a lot of data that's out there, but it's not like it's readily available to just pull up and read and it makes a lot of sense. I mean, there's a lot of jargon. There's a lot to sift through. I know you did some of that, Sam, and we're going to talk at length about that. But where did you start? How do you get started with something like that?
I can't take credit for that. That's Amanda, who calls me at noon last week and says, hey, I have a story idea for you. What do you think about this? And laid it out for me. And I said, okay, great. And then a later text, I believe, almost a direct quotation is, do not cry when you come in. There's a lot of paper on your desk.
Piles.
Piles and piles of paper. And that paper, we found, there's a database that's kept by NASA that allows air traffic controllers, pilots, captains, kind of you name it, involved in this process, to file these confidential reports They're called, they're incident safety reports to talk about these near miss incidents, whether that's in the air or on the ground, signage problems, everything from that. And so there's a lot of interesting data there. And we were talking just before we got started here. It's sorted in a way that allows you to keep a database and maybe track the number of incidents this year versus that year, and that way that gives you context. But what's really interesting about these reports are the narratives that are included by the people that were there. They paint a picture that a dumbed down, fill out the number or aviation in terms of the altitude and the near miss and direction you were going and the time of day it was and et cetera. That all gives you some pretty good concrete information, but the narrative fills in the color that I think is really eye-opening when we got to this story. I read so many reports in a day's worth time. I felt like I could speak a new language. I don't know how fluent I am, but there's so much there that none of us know about. And I'm going to pick on my technologically challenged dad, who was doing some training for work, and he said, I do not know what I do not know. And I think that relates to a lot of us right now in terms of how safe is my airport? Okay, how close are we to breaking that streak? And it turns out just in Milwaukee and in Chicago, we have been very close.
I want to take one step back because you said something kind of brushed right past it, at least to me, which was it was a NASA database. And I go, wait a minute, I thought the FAA took it. Well, why is NASA the one that keeps this database? Do we have any idea why this is a NASA thing?
I still haven't gotten that answer. Do you know that answer?
I do not currently know that answer. And there are certainly people on the national level who have done far deeper reporting on this who probably do have that answer, but that was a surprise to me.
Well, and I want to say, I think that speaks to something here that is true of what we do, and it is, we talk about it often, that, and here on this podcast, that we have to become quick experts in something we know nothing about. Not one of us is an aviation beat reporter. And so,
not even a little bit.
And so you found this database, you looked over the records. I started prepping for this podcast by looking through some of these databases and some of the online materials. We're becoming fast experts on something we are not experts in. So I can't tell you why that's a NASA database, but the FAA has its own databases. This one, what's really interesting, if I understand correctly, is that database of these incidents is voluntary.
Yes.
This is not some required thing that a certain thing happens, you have to fill out this report. These are people who were concerned enough to say, I'm going to say something about this because this is a problem.
And that's really interesting because you think there has to be maybe this threshold, and it's probably different for people in terms of, wow, this was so close. The nose of their plane almost hit us by 15 feet. I need to tell somebody. Think about what they aren't saying in terms of how close they have been. Again, whether that's in the air, on the ground, a signage issue, what name you. There's a lot of concern, and maybe it's uncertainty, but certainly there's concern.
I want to take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about some of what you found in those reports. You've already reported on Fox 6 News, but you only had so much time, so I want to go into some more detail. We'll do that when we come right back. We are back on Open Record. So after this commercial airline crash in Washington, D.C. has everybody talking again about aviation safety, you take a look at a trove of records that spells out some near misses that have occurred that really nobody knows about. At least nobody publicly is talking about a lot of this stuff. You dove into these. You were looking, tell me what you were looking at and what you found.
So we figured the best way to kind of paint this picture for our audience is to consider, I guess, the realities. And first, that if you're flying from our viewing area, you're probably leaving from one of three airports. That would be General Mitchell in Milwaukee, Midway, or O'Hare in Chicago. And certainly we expected coming into this that O'Hare would probably have a greater volume. It is one of the busiest airports in the nation. What we did not expect, I guess, is how close we have come to breaking that long streak, that 15 years without a major fatal airline disaster. Sounds like it's a great streak, right? It is the longest in American history until last week. But just the number of instances and times when we got so close to reporting on something of this magnitude in our market, frankly, it's a little bit frightening. And so there are a number of stories. I mean, we started in this specific story, and that an airport or a pilot is taking off here in Mitchell in 2017, sees a small plane coming toward him. Air traffic controller tells him to keep climbing, which would have put him on that collision course. He does not, and his plane's essentially collision warning system, and that's a colloquial term for it, warns him that, hey, you need to descend right now. He does, fortunately, but he writes in the report, had he followed the air traffic controller's instructions, that would have been a collision.
So the instructions he got from the air traffic controller actually took him in the wrong direction.
That's correct.
That would have put him in the path of this. And you said there's this this warning system that he gets. I know we all have cars now or many of us have these cars that have these sort of automatic detection systems. They'll automatically brake for you. I guess that's not what happens here, right? He still has to make the maneuver.
Correct. It essentially is this kind of, hey, you need to move right now, and certainly alerts them to be able to do so. I'm not sure, again, not an expert. If you were on autopilot, I don't know if it actually just goes ahead and does that. That's something we need to explore. But nevertheless, it says either descend now, or essentially just get out of the way.
You know what I imagine is whoever was on that flight, they're back in their seat, and maybe the airplane suddenly descends, and they go, "Oh, that was kind of a little bit weird," but and then you go back to listening to your, headphones or whatever it is.
You
have
don't
no
know
idea.
what you don't know.
You'd have no idea.
To go back
that
to the
happened.
earlier point.
Yeah, and just the multitude. There's only of 38 incidents over the last 10 years, and that's what we did. We pulled the last 10 years of data. It's 38 at Mitchell, 114 at Midway, and 429 at O'Hare, which again,
Of the voluntarily
reported within this NASA aviation safety database. A lot of the issues at Mitchell, give them credit, are kind of closer to the first 5 years of that rather than the last 5 years. And a lot of it has to do with signage and just confusion. But
are you talking about like things on the ground? Because I know some of these aren't in the air. Some of these are actually on the runways, right?
It seemed like for a while there was some confusion about the labeling of the runways, if I read that right, and which sounds like a whatever thing. But if someone then rolls up somewhere where they're not supposed to be, which is what an incursion is, right? Where it's essentially where you're somewhere where you're not supposed to be with the plane, that could lead to a collision.
Yes. And that's what we saw a lot of in O'Hare, and just looking at the most recent reports for last year and got into in the story is that one pilot wrote that this has happened 2 times this week in terms of someone being in his runway where he is supposed to land. And so, again, I think it's just surprising, not being someone that is involved in this every day, certainly not flying every week, but okay, how close are we actually to dealing with this every single time?
And then there are the other issues that aren't necessarily, oh man, this was almost a collision, but there are other potential ongoing safety issues that could lead to bad things. So I remember there was one of the reports from O'Hare in the narrative. It essentially was someone, and you can feel the frustration of the author of this narrative saying, there's been a repeated problem where I'm hearing the air traffic controllers talking over each other and I'm getting conflicting directions. And this is not the first time it's happened. This is going to cause a problem. And so in reading some of these, you really feel the frustration and in some cases the fear of the person who's writing them. And that's to be expected. Again, it's a voluntary report system, so you usually don't decide to go in and take the trouble of voluntarily writing a report when you feel neutral about something that happened, right? So it's probably someone who felt upset enough about something to go in and file this report. But there were so many things just in the last year, and we found those too at Reagan, going through the reports for Reagan over the last year. In August, there was a near collision between 2 planes on nearby taxiways. That same month, there were warnings about these ongoing problems with planes lining up for the wrong runway. And a quote from that report is, "There is something seriously wrong with this approach that has the potential to cause a serious safety event on an active runway." Let that sink in. In July, a crew had to slam on the brakes to avoid another near collision with a plane on a runway. In April, a situation with a helicopter. A helicopter came within 300 feet of a plane. Pilot didn't initially see it and said there was no warning from air traffic control, and the plane ended up flying over top the helicopter. And then in January last year, so about a year ago, there was a near collision on a runway in which the planes missed each other by less than 6 feet. So that's
That's
all
extraordinarily close.
That's
in an airplane.
Very. And want to emphasize, no one was hurt in any of these cases, and that's why you tend to not hear about them. And we're talking about busy airports when we talk about O'Hare, when we talk about Reagan. Of course, there are going to be more incidents at these airports, but I do think it is important for people to know about these things. I think it's also important for people to know that this isn't just happening any one place. It's not just a one-off.
I did some digging into some of the databases. The database you used, you were able to look at the voluntary stuff. There's some other databases, there's several, in fact, that the FAA tracks a variety of incidents. One is a case analysis and reporting system where they track incidents. And I looked at fatalities, and I will tell you that since 2015, 78 people in Wisconsin have died in aviation incidents, but none of them at Mitchell International Airport. These are all small airplanes. They're not commercial airliners. So in the last 10 years, these are, Cessnas and small single-engine airplanes. I think 3 of the incidents happened in Oshkosh, 6 deaths there. That's home of EAA, the AirVenture annual show. 2 incidents were at Timmerman Airport. Again, this is over the past 10 years, involving 3 deaths in or near the Timmerman area. Most very small airports, or not at airports at all. These are at municipal airfields and things like that. So these are small planes. What I thought was interesting, Illinois, same time frame, 65. So Wisconsin has more deaths than Illinois in terms of aviation. But again, these are all small planes. So if your concern is the commercial airliner, the record is still pretty clear. But then when it comes to these close calls, the runway incursion incidents, I went back to the last major commercial crash in 2009. Since then, 89 serious incidents have been, and when they say serious, meaning a collision was narrowly averted. Like, this was close. 89 of them nationwide in that time. Finally, another one turns into a deadly collision last week. But there have been 89 other incidents that could very well have been disastrous and weren't. That's 5 or 6 a year.
Yeah.
And I looked at Milwaukee, I looked at Chicago. In Milwaukee, only one was labeled a serious incident in that time. That was a narrow collision. That was a ground collision that was avoided in 2012. But what I thought was interesting is the case you talked about in 2017. I thought, well, where's that in here? Is that not serious? And that one falls under category C, I think they called it, which was essentially plenty of time to avoid a collision.
Which is staggering when you think about it.
What you described sounded terrifying, and yet it falls into they had plenty of time. So what does that mean about the ones that were just narrowly avoided? What kind of near collisions are we talking about? That's what I wonder as I look at this. And again, I don't know the ins and outs of these cases. I'm looking at data. I'm trying to interpret it as best I can, but that's what I'm seeing when I look at that.
Well, that's really interesting, given what the NTSB kind of detailed. This would be on Saturday during their press conference when they had started to go through the cockpit voice recorder data from the commercial jet. This is the DC crash. And we are talking seconds where they're on in talking to the air traffic controller. They're notified of the helicopter. They're changed the runway already, and all of a sudden, they're suddenly trying to lift up within seconds. The NTSB gentleman that is actually analyzing and synchronizing all of the transcriptions there on both ends, both the jet and the helicopter, says there's a moment where you can actually hear them describing the impact and reacting to it. And just before that, they were trying to actually lift the plane. And so it is a matter of seconds. And so I guess that plays to your point of, okay, if you have 15 seconds, maybe that's a lot more than a second or 2 or 3.
Well, I think they talk about a near miss constituting something that's within like 500 feet vertically and 3 miles horizontally. And you go, well, 3 miles, that doesn't sound all that close. But in an airplane that's going several hundred miles per hour, that closes quickly. You imagine yourself screaming at 100 miles an hour down a freeway. How much ground do you cover in a very short amount of time? So these close calls, they may well be able to avoid them. It may have been a category C where they had plenty of time to avoid. But if they just don't get that in time, a few seconds too late, and you end up with what happened in Washington, D.C. I want to take one more break. When we come back, I do want to talk about sort of the fact that this has been bubbling under the surface for some time, and it almost seems that there's been some reporting that predicted what happened in Washington, D.C. We're going to talk about that when we come right back. You are listening to or watching Open Record, and we are talking about aviation safety. And with this DC airline crash, has everybody thinking and talking about aviation safety again. But the FAA has been talking about it itself now for a while. In 2023, the FAA put out a warning. This is in February of 2023, saying, we are experiencing the safest period in aviation history, but we can't take this for granted. And they talked about some recent incidents, some concerns. What I thought was really interesting is that they're essentially talking about the need to sort of do a top-to-bottom examination of why of some of these near misses. And they're already looking at it. Right around that time, you have reporting coming out from places like the New York Times, where they did some real in-depth work looking at these near misses, these close calls. And Amanda, you put me in touch with a podcast where they were talking about this, and they were talking before DC. They were talking about the fact that we're on borrowed time here. That there are warning signs, red flags, crises in the aviation safety network or safety net that says something is going to happen here.
Yeah, so this was an episode of The Daily, which is the New York Times podcast, and based on New York Times reporting. And I remember listening to that episode when it came out and just sitting in my car for a little bit. My family flies a lot. My extended family is all on the East Coast. So my husband and my daughters and we all fly minimum 3 times a year. And what they found was truly frightening. And then the second this crash happened, one of my first thoughts was the New York Times predicted this. And their investigation, and they did several different pieces. Like any good investigation, it carried through. But they were, and actually the New York Times investigation is the reason I even thought to check any kind of database and see what was happening here, because I remembered they had gone through some safety reports. They talked about all of these really close call situations, and they were talking about the prevalence of them. They were talking about the shortage of air traffic controllers and the fatigue of the air traffic controllers, many of whom would work really grueling schedules they called the Rattler, and how there were all these different things that were happening at the same time that were leading to more and more errors. And one of the things that they spoke about was the so-called Swiss cheese model. And that's where you have purposeful redundancies.
So layers.
Different layers
Yeah.
of security, and they repeat on purpose. Because the idea is, okay, there might be a hole in one layer. Each layer has a hole, but if you have enough layers, the holes all overlap so that nothing falls all the way through. So, and it's kind of like if you put, and I think about everything in the context of kids, right? So, and I'm crazy about water safety. If we're watching our kids in the water, you know, I'll turn to my husband and say, you got him? He'll repeat back, I got him, right? It's the purposeful redundancy to make sure we're on the same page. It's the same thing here in our air travel system. And
what are some of those different layers in the air travel safety system? I mean, the air traffic controller is one.
Yeah, so think about the close call Sam described in Milwaukee, right? So you have the air traffic controller giving an instruction, but then you have a pilot who is able to use critical thinking, choose not to follow, but also has that warning system.
The technology.
Right?
Yep.
So we're not just relying on the air traffic controller. We also have the technology that can jump in. And I'm sure there are many more levels that I am not technically proficient enough to explain. But there are many built-in redundancies. And the thing the reporter was describing was, with all of these different factors, including the shortage of air traffic controllers and their fatigue and all of these different things converging, the holes in each layer are getting bigger. And that makes it less likely you're going to catch something, and more likely something falls all the way through.
Well, and I think about what happened in D.C. and what we're already hearing gives some examples of that, because on the one hand, you had an air traffic controller, I believe maybe two, they said that were working at Reagan. First of all, Reagan is understaffed, according to records. They are not anywhere near the target staffing that they should be at.
For air traffic controllers.
For air traffic controls.
Yes.
Right, specifically air traffic controllers. On that particular day, they were understaffed for the shift that they were working, the very busy shift. At least two of the air traffic controllers were pulling double duty, including the one who was directly involved in this incident, who was both monitoring commercial jet traffic, but also the helicopter traffic. That is usually
not the ideal
two different
situation.
people. So you're already seeing some larger holes in that layer. You then had the pilots who apparently had been told to, toward the last minute of their descent, to shift to a different runway. So they may be in the plane making the changes they need and not paying attention to sort of a visual inspection of what's going on around them. And then you have the helicopter, which we hear was outside of its elevation, outside of its flight path, its approved flight path. And those helicopter pilots, the military pilots, were wearing night vision goggles, we're told. And did that have anything to do with their vision or their ability to see? They did get a warning from an air traffic controller that, do you see the plane? Do you see this American Airlines plane? And eventually they responded back, yes. What's not clear at this point is, did they see the plane they ultimately crashed into or a different plane that's a busy airfield? So there's a lot of questions, but all of those things come together, and it may be several things that happened at once. It's sort of that example you're saying of there are multiple layers in the system that might have failed, and it fell right through the Swiss cheese.
Yeah, and so I think, I mean, first of all, credit where credit is due to the national reporting on this, that essentially predicted this, and then in the following days. But there is a bigger issue that is not new, that I think is getting more of a spotlight now because of what happened. Because the sad reality is that even though everyone involved knows about the issues, it's when there's a loss of life that after that sometimes there's more urgency to act.
Nor is it unique to Reagan, which is this kind of complex airspace, right, in terms of the airport, but also all of the federal traffic that has to go up and down. And from what we have heard from the Department of Defense, that this Black Hawk pilot was really just doing training that, to dumb it down to its simplest terms, we have training here that our drone pilots have to do every now and then to ensure that they are current. It's really the same thing. And that is a standard flight path for them. Again, the NTSB says that rounding up to the nearest 100 feet, that Black Hawk was at 300 feet. They're supposed to be at 200. And so if you, what they said is essentially whatever the Black Hawk's last elevation or altitude was, that is where that collision happened. And so they're going to take all the data points from there. But I think what's interesting about this and looking at how the FAA through publications of data and kind of studying air traffic controllers across the country is you have a real problem. And you talked about the Rattler. I mean, I think about when I come in and I work a night shift 2 to 11, and then I have to come in the next day and do a 9 to 6:30, we'll call it. That's what the Rattler is.
Or record a podcast.
But I'm not landing planes and have hundreds of thousands perhaps lives in your hand based on all of the traffic that's happening.
Now, I know that I want to, first of all, be very clear. I think we've all said this multiple times, but the NTSB is still investigating. We don't have determination on the cause of that crash. And I don't want to, misinform our listeners or viewers into saying that the air traffic controllers made a mistake here that caused this. We don't know that. But there certainly have been concerns about air traffic control staffing. And it's something the Air Traffic Controllers Union has talked about, is their concerns about staffing levels, these long shifts, the Rattler you're talking about, working 6 days a week, coming in on short sleep. We know that Reagan has had some of these problems. And I'm, they always say, like, for a lawyer, you don't ask a client on the stand a question that you don't know they know the answer to. But I'm still going to ask you, Sam, do we know what staffing levels are like at Mitchell, at O'Hare, at Midway? Do we know if that's a concern here? I assume there must be some level of that because it's a nationwide issue.
So the latest available report, which is a 2024 data report from the FAA, that since the New York Times reporting on, frankly, the troubles and fractured system for air traffic control employees across the U.S. has forced the FAA to act, and part of that is this kind of fix the problem response, I will call it. And as part of that, they are assessing the air traffic control level of employees at every tower in the country, and what it should be, what it's at, and then also the number of folks that are in training, because this is not something that you can get trained up on in a month, or 2 months, 3 months. It takes years. And you have to be a certain person. I believe you actually, to
there are
start
a lot
this
of
training,
requirements.
you have to be 31. That's as old as you can be, which is really interesting. And I would love to dive more into that at a later time. But it's using data from September of 2023. It takes into account the number of people that are being trained. But for Milwaukee, it's fewer than 60% staffed.
And what surprised me the most about this is that this still ties back to the FAA strikes of the 1980s. I mean, how can you explain how there's a connection 40 years ago to what we're dealing with now?
I don't know. Can you?
Well, I'll tell you what I've heard, and I'm just relaying other reporting. But I mean, so you had President Reagan at the time who said, "Well, we're just going to replace all of you," and so they brought in a bunch of people at once. But that broke up the natural cycle of hiring and retirement. And so what they're saying is that now you've got all of these people retiring at once who've reached this, time where they just don't have it. Now the pandemic played a role too, because as you have mass retirements, then the pandemic hits and you're not training people up because of health and safety reasons.
And it's a grueling schedule, and you're not getting paid millions of dollars to do this job.
And then on top of all of that, you have President Trump, who recently talked about offering federal workers, essentially a buyout, right? Retire, and you'll get, however many months of pay. That has been taken off the table for the FAA, for air traffic controllers, specifically because you don't want to encourage more people to retire right now when they're already this short-staffed. So it's interesting that actually has already come into place. And we're not offering that to them because we need you. One of the rare areas where I think the Trump administration has admitted we need these people around.
And I believe the FAA is without a head of its agency, right? And that was one of the people that was either forced to leave or resign shortly after he took office.
As of the plane crash.
Yeah.
So there's obviously a lot of data, a lot still to learn. I think there are more stories to be explored in this area. It sounds like you have some thoughts in mind.
Certainly. We've reached out to, first off, the airports, who all point us to the FAA, because it's the FAA who essentially is the air traffic controller for all of the airports, right? But really want to get in touch with the Air Traffic Controllers Union, which nationally has been quite busy, as you might imagine. But just to hear from the folks that can kind of put into context for us what they're dealing with locally. I mean, the stories that we have read nationally from people, the amounts of caffeine they're consuming, the stress that they are carrying, sleeping on the job, using drugs on the job because they just have to cope somehow. It is frightening.
I want to say to anyone who's listening, because I think of it, 3 journalists doing the best we can to make the most of what we've learned in a short amount of time. There are people who are going to watch or listen to this who are going to know a lot more than we know. And we want to hear from you. And we'd like to hear from you. I'll give it right now. I'm going to give it at the end of the podcast. But send us an email to FOX6 Investigators at fox.com. If you want to tell us more about what you know, if there are things you think that the public ought to know about safety concerns in the aviation industry, we definitely want to hear from you. I'm really glad you've done this digging. I'm excited to see what else you find. Both Amanda and Sam, thank you for being on here. We are going to take a break, and when we do, we will come back and go off the record. And it is time for us to go off the record. This is the part of the podcast where we get a little more casual and have a little fun by answering a question for which we have not prepared, and I haven't, but I do have the question here, which was given to me by Open Records executive producer Sarah Smith. So I had to know it would be a Super Bowl related question because Super Bowl means food, and she loves food questions. So with the Super Bowl this weekend on Fox 6, by the way, a lot of people will be hosting or attending parties for the game. A new study shows the top 3 Super Bowl snacks in Wisconsin are chips and dips, chicken wings, and cookies. What is a must-have snack or appetizer at your Super Bowl party or one that you would like to attend?
Do I get follow-up questions?
Because you have more than one?
Well, it depends on who's making the cookies. It depends on who's making the chips and dip. Like, am I making them? Or is someone bringing them? Like, if Sam's wife Courtney is bringing the cookies, then my answer is cookies.
I'm going to say if
I have to make the cookies, it is not cookies.
No, if you're judging someone else's party based on what is the one thing that they should have had every party, what would you say that is?
Someone else go first.
I just want to chime in real quick that I don't think chicken wings are a snack, but that's just me.
Hot
It
take.
depends. Boneless snack. Wings with bone-in wings are real wings.
I'll accept
right?
that.
Yeah,
I'll accept
okay.
that.
So chips and dip,
Still different.
chicken wings, or cookies. These are three very different things.
My friends of mine have gotten together and done dip games, what we call dip games, in which everyone brings essentially a dip and a carb, maybe 2 dips, 2 carbs. Buffalo chicken dip is almost always a top one.
I think something with buffalo in it to me.
I don't
Yeah.
like buffalo.
Oh,
Wow.
Buffalo chicken dip is that's my specialty. That's what I will bring to the party.
Yeah.
And Frank's Red Hot sauce. Some ranch dressing.
To me personally, you can't go wrong.
Cream cheese. It's
Yeah.
But the one thing that'll top that for me is a really good beer cheese dip.
Okay.
Okay.
Beer cheese dip and chips. That for me, if you have that at your party, I'm set. I'm happy. That crack open a cold one and I'm all good.
See, for me, it's like any snack I get to eat without my kids taking part of it. So I don't.
So wait, so then do you
don't
see
know.
things that they're
Unique
not going
experience.
to like? See,
Yes.
that's where the buffalo comes in handy.
Yeah. Oh no, but they like it. I don't.
Oh, they do.
Yes.
Oh, I don't
So,
think most.
but
I didn't think most kids would.
Yeah,
it's
I didn't
too
think so
spicy.
either.
My
Yeah.
kids have expansive palates. Their favorite food is salmon. So
What?
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Whose kids?
My
I mean,
5 and 3-year-old
so they like
and Brussels sprouts.
spicy things.
Salmon and Brussels
okay,
sprouts.
there's something not
That's
right
Yes.
with
awry.
any of this. I
Yes.
came to love Brussels sprouts when I was about 45, and now I'm happy with them. But
Well,
before that, no, I was not a fan.
my 5-year-old then is a few years ahead of you in that journey.
I've now learned anything you put olive oil and some salt and pepper on will be fine.
And I do
Virtually
honey on the
anything.
Brussels sprouts. But no, I think if it's like a thing, if I'm judging someone else's party, if someone else is making stuff and they're a good baker, I will gravitate toward the cookies.
Does the drink selection play into your judgment of the party, though? Like, for instance, I'm a Coke product drinker. It's got to be Coke products, or I don't just want Miller Lite. I want specialty beers, or
This
I don't know.
episode brought to you
Dave
by
isn't talking, but he's probably thinking a good bourbon or something, right?
Not for a football game. No.
Not for a football game. Okay, what's your football game? That's just beer.
Yeah, just regular beer. And
Okay.
The older I've gotten, the more of a wuss I've gotten. I just drink light beer now. No IPAs or anything.
Hey, it made Bob Uecker a career in commercials and other things. So, with regard to the Super Bowl, are you I go to Super Bowl parties? Are you I'll stay home and watch the game? Are you I don't care about the Super Bowl at all?
This year, Sam and I are the I'm going to go to work type.
Yeah,
Okay, all right.
That's our party.
Yeah.
Normally, I would get together with friends and do one of those things, which I'm going to add a couple more for you guys. If you don't want to cook, Festival has a cannoli dip.
Ooh.
And if you don't know, now you know. Think about it, just the cannoli chips broken down, and then that cream that goes in the middle is your dip, and you will thank me later.
I'm into it.
But yeah, just everybody brings something to pass, and if you complain about the drinks, well, you could have brought something to drink as well.
There you go. All right, Sam
So-
is what you contribute is what you
Yeah.
Exactly.
yeah, okay.
It is the sum of the masses.
If you are not working, though, are you I'm more interested in the game, the commercials, both, or neither?
But what do you? You've known me for a few years.
Well, not the game.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't like football. So the commercials I'll
You
take.
don't like ball sports.
I don't like.
Narrows it down.
Okay. I like baseball. I don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Yeah. Baseball is the one I can sit there and watch and be interested in what's happening. Not football. But the commercials, I'll take a passing interest, but I'd honestly rather just watch the recap of the good ones later. I'm an extrovert.
okay.
I'm there for the party.
That's what I was going to say. So, but you still like the
I'm
party
socializing.
because it's the party atmosphere.
Yes.
Sure. Okay.
Yes.
All the above. Interested in the game. Certainly more interested if the Packers are going to be in it. And by this time, there's no fantasy football implications, so that not watching for that. The ads, I think, I'm always interested in, just from being in J school and having to watch them for class and grade what worked, what didn't. For example, there's a toilet paper company this year that's doing nothing for 30 seconds so that you can get up, go to the bathroom, and come back. I think that's brilliant. Is that going to make me buy their toilet paper? I don't know. But I always am just really interested to see, and I always think it's so interesting that they have all of these creative budgets, and I know it comes down to money, but just think about what you can do all year if you advertise that way, not just for one night.
I know that I love the game because I love high-stakes sporting events. The commercials are interesting, but now you can watch them in advance or after the fact, so I'm more interested in the game, probably. But that's all the time we have to talk about this today. We are going to take a break and wrap things up this week right after this. And that is all the time we have for Open Record this week. If you have a topic you would like us to discuss on Open Record or an issue you think we should investigate for Fox 6 News, please send us an email to fox6investigators@fox.com. Amanda, Sam, thank you for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Let's also be sure to thank the people who make this podcast possible, including our executive producer, Sarah Smith, our editor, Dave Machuda, who's manning the video switcher today, and our chief photographer, Cale Zimney. With that, I'm Bryan Polcyn. We'll be back next week.